Let me tell you something about prison work in the galactic community that most species don't want to admit. Humans are the undisputed champions of correctional management. And not just because we're good at it, but because every other sentient species is hilariously unqualified. Take the Voxorian methane breathers, for example. Imagine trying to run a prison when your guards dissolve into a chemical panic if an inmate looks at them wrong. Or the silicon-based Krell, who communicate through complex electromagnetic pulses and have the emotional range of a particularly moody computer server. Their idea of rehabilitation involves recalibrating circuit boards and running diagnostic tests. Humans? We're the Swiss Army knife of prison management. Adaptable, unpredictable, borderline psychologically indestructible. The Galactic Corrections Consortium didn't choose humans by accident. They chose us because we're the only species that looks at a maximum security facility housing creatures that could casually vaporize entire planetary ecosystems and thinks, yeah, I can handle this. Our secret? We come from Earth. A planet so monumentally dangerous that surviving childhood there is basically a qualification for dealing with intergalactic criminal masterminds. Most alien species view human history like a horror documentary. A planet where humans deliberately inject themselves with weakened diseases to become immune. Children play contact sports for fun. People voluntarily jump out of perfectly functional aircraft. An entire subspecialty of medicine exists just to treat injuries people get for entertainment. From the perspective of a Zorblaxian diplomat, humans aren't just a species. We're walking, talking psychological warfare units with an inexplicable love for complicated coffee drinks and extreme sports. The galactic prison system wasn't designed with human psychology in mind. It was designed with logical, predictable species in mind. Species that followed protocols. Species that didn't view an attempted prison break as an interesting problem-solving exercise. Humans see rules as suggestions. Protocols as starting points. A maximum security prison isn't a challenge to be feared, it's a puzzle waiting to be solved. Which brings me to Jack Rodriguez, former Earth Corrections Officer, current Intergalactic Corrections Bureau recruit. A man who looked at the most complex correctional challenge in the known universe and thought, sounds like a Tuesday. His file was interesting. Graduated top of his class from the New Mexico Corrections Academy. Special commendation for de-escalating a prison riot using nothing more than a granola bar and what witnesses described as weaponized sarcasm. Psychological profile that made most alien HR departments twitch: high adaptability, low panic response, and an uncanny ability to make potential threats feel slightly embarrassed about their life choices. The consortium didn't hire Jack. They practically begged him to join. His first assignment? The Nexus 9 detention facility. A prison so complex it made Earth's most secure facilities look like summer camp. A place where inmates weren't just dangerous, they were conceptually terrifying. Prisoners from species that could reshape molecular structures with a thought. Entities that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Beings whose very existence was a violation of several fundamental physical laws. And humanity's response? Sounds like we're going to need more coffee. Jack Rodriguez was about to become living proof of why humans are the universe's ultimate corrections specialists. Not through brute force. Not through advanced technology. But through something far more dangerous: being completely, wonderfully unpredictable. Jack Rodriguez wasn't what most people expected when they heard intergalactic prison guard. Standing at a solid 6'2", with skin the color of well-worn leather and eyes that looked like they'd seen every possible variation of human nonsense, he looked more like a retired mixed martial arts coach than an interstellar corrections officer. His journey started, ironically, in a small county jail in southern New Mexico. 10 years of dealing with everything from drunk and disorderly cowboys to meth-addled conspiracy theorists had prepared him for exactly, well, everything. The recruitment process for the Intergalactic Corrections Bureau wasn't your typical job interview. It was more like a psychological demolition derby designed to break down candidates and see what remained. First, they put him through a series of simulated prison scenarios. Not just any scenarios, nightmares that would make most species curl into fetal positions and quietly weep. Scenario 1, a telepathic inmate attempting to manipulate guard psychology while simultaneously trying to restructure molecular bonds. Most candidates would freeze. Jack's response? He started singing the most irritatingly catchy pop song he knew. effectively creating a mental firewall that drove the telepath to frustrated surrender. Scenario 2, a shape-shifting prisoner attempting to create psychological discord by mimicking loved ones and past trauma. The alien evaluator's expected breakdown. Jack started critiquing the shapeshifter's impersonation techniques, offering acting tips and pointing out historical inaccuracies in the mimicry. Look, he'd said during the debrief, if you're going to try to mess with my head, at least do your research. My grandmother's accent was way more Brooklyn and way less generic emotional manipulation. The Bureau's lead recruiter, a crystalline being named KX Tal whose communication involved complex light refraction patterns, was simultaneously impressed and slightly terrified. Jack's psychological profile read like a manual on controlled chaos: high stress tolerance, zero panic response, an ability to transform potential confrontations into awkward social interactions that left opponents more confused than aggressive. His final recommendation came with a note that roughly translated to approach with caution, possibly more dangerous when calm. The Nexus 9 detention facility wasn't just another prison. It was the galaxy's most complex correctional experiment, designed to contain prisoners who could potentially destroy entire star systems if they got bored. Inmates included a quantum state criminal who existed simultaneously as both matter and energy, sentient plasma being with anger management issues, multiple trans-dimensional entities whose mere presence could warp local reality. Most species would require entire battalions of guards, advanced containment technology, and multiple fail-safe protocols. Humanity's solution. 1. Jack Rodriguez. During his initial briefing, the facility's AI tried to provide him with approximately 17,000 pages of procedural documentation. Jack's response was to grab a coffee, flip to a random page and say, "Looks complicated. I'm sure we'll figure it out." The AI's quantum processors briefly stuttered, unable to compute such casual confidence. Mr. Rodriguez, the AI's voice modulator clicked with precise uncertainty. "Are you aware of the complex multidimensional security protocols required for this facility?" Jack took a long sip of coffee. Protocols are just fancy words for suggestions we haven't ignored yet. And just like that, he became the most interesting thing the Nexus 9 had seen in several galactic standard centuries. Part 3, First Major Challenge: Prison Containment Complexity. The Nexus 9 detention facility wasn't just a prison. It was an architectural nightmare designed by someone who thought MC Escher was a minimalist. Containment zones shifted probability. Walls existed in quantum superposition. Prisoners weren't just locked up, they were mathematically constrained by laws of physics that most species couldn't even comprehend. Jack's first official day began with a briefing that sounded more like a theoretical physics lecture than a correctional orientation. Each containment zone. Drone Supervisor VL Rec. A translucent crystalline administrator whose body constantly refracted light in mathematically perfect patterns, operates on non-Euclidean principles. Prisoner movement is calculated through probabilistic wave functions rather than traditional spatial mechanics. Jack nodded, took another sip of coffee. So basically they can't escape unless they're really motivated and good at advanced calculus. VL Rec's crystalline structure momentarily flickered, the alien equivalent of a stunned blink. That is, an unexpectedly accurate summation. The facility's primary challenge wasn't just containing dangerous entities. It was preventing them from getting bored. Boredom, in this context, was a far more dangerous state than anger or aggression. Take Zartak, the quantum state criminal currently occupying Containment Zone Epsilon. Technically, he's so much as a continuously shifting probability cloud with occasional moments of semi-solid consciousness. Zartak could simultaneously exist in multiple dimensional states. Most guards approached his cell with sophisticated quantum stabilization equipment and enough mathematical models to make Stephen Hawking's head spin. Jack approached with a chess set. "Hey," he called into the shimmering, reality-warping space that constituted Zartak's cell, "want to play a game?" The probability cloud hesitated, shifted, condensed. Chess came a voice that sounded like mathematical equations having an existential crisis. Is a human construct based on linear strategic thinking. I can calculate 10 to 47 potential moves simultaneously. Jack grinned. "Great. That makes you overqualified. Your move. What happened next was less a chess game and more an interdimensional negotiation. Sortak's moves violated several known laws of spatial reasoning. Jack countered by occasionally humming off key pop songs, which seemed to temporarily destabilize the quantum criminal's concentration. 3 hours later, Sortak was not only contained but actually engaged in something other than plotting multidimensional mayhem. "Checkmate," Jack said, setting down a bishop in a position that should have been mathematically impossible. AV Velrec, monitoring the interaction, sent an urgent communication to the Galactic Corrections Consortium. The message was short: human appears to be negotiating with quantum criminal using inexplicable methods. The other inmates took notice. Zara, the sentient plasma being known for melting through 17 different types of containment fields, watched Jack's interactions with growing fascination. Plasma didn't typically do fascination, but Jack was making interdimensional exceptions look routine. Most guards. Zara's energy field pulsed in communication. Attempt to contain. You seem to be entertaining. Jack shrugged. Containment is boring. Interaction is interesting. By the end of his first week, Jack had convinced a trans-dimensional being to take up watercolor painting, taught chess to a quantum probability cloud, negotiated a peace treaty between two prisoners who had been attempting to destroy each other across multiple realities. The Galactic Corrections Consortium started to realize something fundamental: humans didn't just guard prisoners. They fundamentally rewrote the entire concept of correctional management. And Jack was just getting started. Every prison has a breaking point. At Nexus 9, that breaking point arrived on a Tuesday because of course it did. The initial warning came from an unlikely source: Zara, the sentient plasma being who had become something of a Jack Rodriguez fan club president. Its energy field pulsed with an urgent message that translated roughly to "something is very wrong, and I'm actually concerned." Most alien prisoners viewed human guards as predictable, systematic, rule followers. Jack Rodriguez was none of those things. The conspiracy had been brewing across multiple dimensional planes, 17 different species, 53 distinct communication methods, one unified goal: a coordinated prison break that would make every previous escape attempt look like a failed magic trick. Their fatal mistake. They assumed Jack would respond like a traditional corrections officer. The first sign of trouble came when the facility's quantum stabilization field began experiencing micro-fluctuations. Most guards would have initiated standard protocol lockdown, emergency containment, massive energy consumption. Jack made coffee. Not just any coffee. He pulled out a small portable espresso maker he'd smuggled past regulations, ground beans he'd personally imported from a small plantation in Guatemala, and started brewing. The smell, rich, complex, utterly terrestrial, began filling the corridors. Prisoners in adjacent cells started changing, not physically, psychologically. The trans-dimensional being who had been painting watercolors paused mid-brushstroke. The quantum probability cloud stopped its intricate mathematical calculations. Even Zara's plasma field seemed to vibrate with a different frequency. Something about the coffee was disrupting their carefully planned chaos. EVL Rec. The crystalline administrator watched in mounting horror as Jack continued brewing, completely casual about the impending multidimensional crisis. Mr. Rodriguez, the administrator's light refracting body trembled. "Are you aware that multiple prisoners are currently synchronizing their escape attempts?" Jack looked up, smiled, took a sip of espresso. "Yep." The escape attempt was beautiful in its complexity. A synchronized event involving quantum tunneling, dimensional shifting, plasma transformation, and probability manipulation that would have required centuries of planning by most species. It lasted exactly 17 minutes. Jack's response wasn't technological. It wasn't strategic in any traditional sense. He simply started telling stories. Stories about Earth, about New Mexico, about his grandmother's cooking, about a high school road trip gone hilariously wrong. Each story was a thread that somehow rewove the fabric of interdimensional reality. Sortak, the quantum criminal, found himself listening instead of escaping. Zara's plasma field condensed into something approximating rapt attention. The trans-dimensional painter set down his brush. By the time Jack finished his third story, a particularly ridiculous tale involving a rodeo, 3 chickens, and a malfunctioning GPS, the entire escape attempt had dissolved. EVL Rex crystalline structure was practically vibrating with confused admiration. How the administrator's light pattern spelled out, did you just neutralize a multi-species trans-dimensional prison break with anecdotes? Jack finished his espresso, shrugged. Humans are weird, he said. Sometimes that's our best defense. The Galactic Corrections Consortium would later classify the incident as Rodriguez Protocol narrative containment. No one could quite explain how it worked, but everyone agreed it was effective. And just another Tuesday for Jack Rodriguez. Some days, even for a human, the universe decides to turn the difficulty setting up to maximum. For Jack Rodriguez, that day arrived with a prisoner classified simply as null, an entity so dangerous that its file came with 17 different warning stamps and a note that essentially said good luck and maybe say your prayers. Null wasn't just a prisoner. It was a conceptual threat. Imagine an intelligence that could unravel the fundamental laws of reality like a bored child picking apart a sweater. Not malicious, exactly. Just fundamentally uninterested in the constraints of existence. The facility's quantum containment systems had 17 redundant fail-safes, backup generators that could power small planets, dimensional stabilization fields that made quantum mechanics look like elementary school math. Null regarded these precautions the way a human might look at a child's blanket fort. The breach began subtly. Walls started forgetting they were walls. Gravity became a suggestion rather than a law. Time itself began to hiccup, with moments stretching and compressing like an accordion played by a drunk musician. EVL Rex crystalline form was basically having the administrative equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Alarm systems spoke 17 different languages simultaneously, all saying essentially the same thing: we are monumentally screwed. Jack's response? He walked into Null's containment zone with a thermos of coffee and a deck of playing cards. So he said conversationally, "Want to play Go Fish?" Null paused, which, for an entity that could potentially unmake reality, was saying something. The confrontation wasn't physical. It wasn't technological. It was a battle of fundamentally incompatible psychological approaches. Null represented pure, unfiltered potential. No boundaries, no restrictions, complete and utter freedom from any conceptual constraint. Jack represented something far more terrifying: a human who found bureaucratic nonsense mildly amusing and saw reality as a suggestion. Their game of Go Fish lasted what might have been simultaneously 5 minutes and 17 years. Cards moved in ways that violated every known law of physics. Probability itself seemed to be negotiating terms of surrender. "Got any sevens?" Jack would ask, as reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Null would respond not with words, but with entire potential universes flickering in and around the playing card. Most species would have been overwhelmed, driven mad, reduced to mathematical equations of pure terror. Jack asked if Null wanted cream for its theoretical coffee. The facility's sensors went absolutely berserk. Quantum mechanics threw up its hands in total surrender. Dimensional barriers started taking mental health days. And then, impossibly, incredibly, Jack won the card game. Not through technology, not through advanced understanding of multidimensional physics, but by being so fundamentally, wonderfully human that even reality itself seemed confused. Null didn't just stop its escape attempt. It seemed impressed. "Interesting," the entity said, in a voice that sounded like mathematical equations, sighing, "You are not predictable." Jack shuffled the cards, grinned. "Nobody ever is," he replied. "Until they are." EL Rec would later file a report that would be read, reread, and ultimately filed under what the actual quantum nonsense just happened. The Galactic Corrections Consortium would add another notation to Jack Rodriguez's file. Recommendation: do not attempt to understand. Just appreciate. The aftermath of the Null incident became legendary across multiple galactic jurisdictions, not because of its technical complexity, but because of its sheer human absurdity. Diplomatic communiques from various alien governmental bodies tried and spectacularly failed to understand what had actually happened. The reports read like fever dreams translated by committee. Subject Rodriguez neutralized a reality-breaking entity, one report stated, using a standard 52-card deck and what appears to be caffeine. The Galactic Corrections Consortium held an emergency session. Not to reprimand Jack, not to investigate the incident, but to try and understand the fundamental human approach to, well, everything. EVL Rec, now something of a human behavior expert by necessity, attempted to explain. Humans, the crystalline administrator's light patterns spelled out, do not see limitations. They see opportunities for creative problem solving. Jack Rodriguez, for his part, continued doing exactly what he'd always done. Brewing coffee, playing cards with reality-warping prisoners, treating interdimensional threats like slightly challenging crossword puzzles. The prison's inmates had become something of a support group. The quantum criminal played chess, the plasma being took up watercolor painting. The transdimensional entity was working on a memoir titled Imprisonment and Improvisational Storytelling. When asked about his methods, Jack would simply shrug. Earth, he would say, is a planet where surviving childhood is basically advanced combat training. This he would gesture around the multidimensional detention facility. This is just another Tuesday. The broader galactic community slowly began to understand a fundamental truth about humanity. Humans weren't just a species. They were a universal constant of controlled chaos. Other species designed complex systems. Humans looked at those systems and said, "Hold my coffee." Null, the reality-breaking entity, would occasionally send Jack postcards. Not physical postcards, mind you. More like momentary reality fluctuations that translated to checking in. Still impressed. Jack would respond by sending back Polaroid photos of New Mexico landscapes which somehow managed to confuse an entity that could perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Nexus 9 detention facility became less a prison and more a bizarre interdimensional community center. Prisoners weren't just contained. They were rehabilitated, engaged, occasionally bewildered. And at the center of it all, one human corrections officer who saw the universe not as a series of immutable laws, but as an interesting puzzle waiting to be solved. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology, wasn't advanced weaponry, wasn't superior intellect. It was the ability to look at the impossible and say, I've seen weirder. As for Jack Rodriguez, he was already planning his next shift, coffee brewing, cards shuffling, reality negotiating its terms of surrender. Just another day at the office,